Mark, let me hand over to you. Why don't you give us your presentation? You have a PowerPoint, right? You need to upload it. Do you have?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Salim. I have a PowerPoint which and I can share my screen to talk through that. But yeah, first let me just say thanks very much for inviting me to contribute in this small way to the Gobeshona conference. And the 24-hour cycle agenda that you mentioned is impressive and intimidating at the same time. So I'm glad I can be a small part of that. So let me share my screen now. Good. So you should be able to see
Yes,
my
go
screen.
ahead.
Super. So what I wanted to, sorry, what I wanted to do was just paint a broad picture of what I see as some of the challenge, but also an exciting opportunity for citizen science, for local-based research, for action research, particularly in the context of urban low-income communities and their associations with urban authorities around climate change adaptation. My own background is mainly in climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction in urban contexts of the global south, but also the US and UK. So I'm interested in the ways in which local practices can combine with institutions at the community level and then at higher levels of organization to have greater impact. And then the ways in which those institutions, those higher level institutions, sometimes are rather challenging to engage with. So that could be local, national government, or indeed NGOs and humanitarian agencies as well. So I see there's some challenges and some opportunities around those relationships for an inclusive and socially just adaptation agenda because of the urgency that climate change brings, but also, of course, because of COVID-19. So there's a little outline here on the first slide of what I'd like to talk through in the next 20 minutes or so. And many of you will be well aware of the broad narrative, but I think what I want to do is ask us the question, so what for local co-produced data and analytical work? So by co-produced, I mean data collection and analysis, problem framing that brings together researchers and local actors. So I'll say something about climate action, something about the urgency, the need for integrated and inclusive climate adaptation work. I'll say something about COVID-19 and what that means for urban vulnerability creation. And then in conclusion, I suppose one of the key messages is that the urgency around climate and the COVID renewal is an opportunity, I think, to redouble our efforts around inclusive governance and inclusive knowledge co-production for very targeted vulnerability actions that can have benefits that go way beyond just climate change or local disaster risk reduction. Let me start then by saying something about the status of urbanization. And these are big figures, sometimes difficult to understand really what they mean, but in summary, and you can read the screen, in summary, we are over the next 20 years and in the midst of rapid urban growth. So let me read some of these figures for you. Every 5 days, the urban population increases by about 1 million people. Urban areas will expand by about 100 kilometers squared every day through to 2050. And globally, 60% of the area expected to be urban by 2030 is yet to be built from 2017. So those are, very motivating, I think, in as much as whilst we talk about accumulated risk, and I'll come to that in a second, a lot of the risk, a lot of the built structures, the community networks, knowledge networks in cities are in the process of being built. So this is part of the opportunity. If we as local action researchers can engage not just in existing communities, but somehow in the process of formation, which suggests a need to engage with processes of urban land ownership and transfer, the economics of urbanization. So that's part of the opportunity. If we can, and indeed it's a question, is community-based work, does it have leverage into that kind of futures-looking agenda? But of course, the other half is the urban land which is already built. 49% of urban population in low and middle income countries is without safely managed drinking water. So there's a huge amount of accumulated vulnerability, often associated with failures of development to provide even basic services, but also, of course, counterbalanced with a lot of ingenuity, energy, and progressive decision-making, action and investment in low-income urban settlements. So there's a broadening of the opportunity, not just looking at accumulation of risk, but looking at the way in which urbanization itself is creating risk going forwards and asking questions about how we can engage in that in a progressive way. Climate change then layers on top of these processes of rapid urbanization, and climate adaptation asks us questions around urgency, integration, and inclusion. And I'll just take each of those in turn. I'll start with some again, really compelling facts around climate change. If you're able to see the map on the right hand of the screen here, it really demonstrates three global areas where there is an association in projections between rapid urban growth at scale, so where most of the urban growth is happening, and places exposed to climate risk. So West Africa, South Asia, and China, particularly coastal Southeast Asia, China region. So that's, if you like, if we want to focus our resources and efforts, that's a set of geographies. Perhaps one should say that some of the most rapidly expanding areas that are left off this map are around sub-Saharan Africa and more broadly Southeast Asia, where smaller urban settlements are growing quickly. So they're not picked up in this analysis, which is really looking at aggregate urban growth rather than those smaller centres that are, though, growing very quickly and where growth far outstrips capacity to manage climate risk and provide services. So any research into innovative ways in providing those services is good, and indeed mapping the sorts of urban changes that are happening in order to advocate appropriately for investment or to support community action is good. And that's left outside of that particular image on the right-hand side. But you might have had a chance now to have read some of the facts just to set up the urgency around climate change. The C40 UCCRN predict by 2050 that 1.6 billion people will be regularly exposed to high temperatures. 800 million will be vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal flooding, and 650 million will be at risk from water shortages. The IPCC researchers, often based on what's called the SSPs. So these are shared socio-economic pathways, a set of models that try to integrate development trends with climate trends. So still projections, and there's lots of critique of them, but they underline some of this urgency that, for example, the exposure of urban population to deadly heat will increase from 600 million to possibly 3, 4, maybe up towards 5 billion. And that's at the lower end. That's if we have deep carbon cuts. If there's a lack of that, it goes up to 5 billion with more certainty. with extreme rainfall as well. McPherson et al., thinking about urban infrastructure and a similar set of assumptions, have identified 20% of power generation globally lies up to 5 meters from sea level. And clearly any disruption of that power generation alone will lead to knock-on impacts around urban transportation, human mobility, social and health infrastructures, and with economic impact, particularly they find in the global south. So here are a set of impacts, and it's a comment I'll come to in the next slide, but I hope you can also see that these are not just impacts in place, but they begin to be impacts where cities are connected, whether it's connection of critical infrastructure, so power generation failures leading to knock-on cascading impacts, or through impacts outside of urban areas that impact in the city through things like water shortages. So there are, of course, implications for local action research. For example, how far, if we feel climate change is urgent, should adaptation research also consider mitigation, as well as our association with justice? Or should we keep mitigation and adaptation quite separate in the kinds of research that we do? And certainly for citizen science, there's a responsibility almost. Certainly one would think there's a real need for funders to invest in citizen science that can really deliver excellent monitoring, appropriate to community capacities, but still excellent, that monitoring to enable assessment of risks, of infrastructure needs and the status of infrastructure against risk in order to feed into planning, and that planning can be in partnership with local governments to go beyond a community-focused lens. So there's some questions for funders there as well as researchers. To spend a couple of minutes thinking about the integrated element of climate change adaptation, you can see a figure on the right, which is part of a great paper that shows how the impacts of a flood event in Southeast Asia cascade across the globe through disruptions to supply chains. And there are two arguments I want to make here. I guess I've foregrounded them already, that integration has two faces. One, a result of cascading risk and loss, and the other as a result of the concentration of those cascades in particular places and with particular people. And all of that, I think, sets up challenges for local action-based research. To look at cascades, first of all, and there are several ways in which cascades happen, although there's very little research on this, and it seems a really important area for further work. But there are supply chain disruptions, as I've indicated. For example, the Bangkok floods in 2011 as a great example where a lot of the global semiconductor manufacturing takes place in Bangkok, and there was disruption which had implications worldwide. Remittance flows, of course, can be stopped when places, particularly larger cities where migrants will have moved to, are impacted. Hurricane Sandy is one example which had global implications, but any urban event will have implications for remittance flows. Those remittances, of course, are used for individual family development, but also in reconstructing. So if there are parallel events, this can have an even more magnified impact, these connections. Teleconnected impacts are those where an impact in one place is felt somewhere else. So the food riots in sub-Saharan Africa of 2007 and 2008 are a great example. These were stimulated by a combination of the failure of wheat harvests in Australia, in North America and Russia, fed then through market speculation and price rises, leading to food insecurity in African cities. So how can communities exposed to food shocks now understand the production of risk when it is actually at distance? And of course, as I've indicated in the previous slide, risks and impacts cross infrastructures within cities. That example of electricity generation leading breakages leading to impacts in transport and health and social infrastructure. So for us, I think the challenge is to think, is there a place for community-based action research in understanding cascading processes? Certainly, I think we need to increasingly think about the ways in which local places are exposed to flows that come into those communities, and whether there's a role for community action and data that's collected at the local level to feed into the understanding of the unfolding nature of these cascades is an open question. I would think there is, but there's very little research on that I've seen. And more research, though, is on the concentration of risk in highly vulnerable places and amongst marginalized populations. But this hasn't really been associated with the idea of cascades. And there are perhaps two, and this is just hypothetical, kind of a view rather than based on knowledge, but perhaps there are two forms of urban process that concentrate cascades. Firstly, in highly connected but highly unequal cities, where vulnerability actually enables risk and burden shifting from the rich to the poor. So one sees that in things like informal economies, low wage economies, lack of investment in health infrastructure and others, where by those economic systems being in place, if there is an additional risk in the city, the loss can be shifted. The second set of connections in less well-connected low capacity settlements, where risk has historically accumulated through poverty drivers in slums and populations at risk. So there are perhaps those two processes that of course can perhaps come together in some contexts. What does that mean for local action research? Well, to repurpose the vision and tools of urban planning to recognize risk cascades and risk concentration. It is a sort of rethinking of what the city is. We often come to think of the city as a set of discrete places, urban planning being based around land use, but perhaps this is asking us to think more about cities as places within networks of flowing resources, of remittances, supply chains, and so on. And we need to understand those flows better in order to understand what's happening in places at risk. So what are the drivers for the risk that we see in local places? And are these opportunities for local action to work with those structural factors that we know also constrain what can happen locally? A quick couple of words on inclusive. Now, we know a lot, of course, about the importance of inclusive decision making, and there are, in the first point there, I described some of the advantages that come with that, and I won't go through those. But I think we also have learned, certainly from the humanitarian sector, that there's a tension between inclusivity and urgency. The norm in post-disaster contexts is for NGOs, humanitarians, to deploy their best practice around needs, saving lives, providing shelter, food and water, but without considerations for governance. So inclusivity becomes shunted on the side. Now, if we have a global climate emergency that is framed around the language of urgency, it seems really important that we as community action researchers defend the importance of inclusivity within urgency. Inclusivity can't be pushed to the side through claims of urgency. But we do need to think how to do that. And one quick example, I won't go into detail, but just to illustrate the importance of this, comes from a project I was involved with, led by Christian Aid, around the concept of survivor-led reconstruction. And it's a simple idea that historically humanitarians, when looking at past events, have asked their staff to assess outcomes, but not asked local survivors, which seems obvious, but hasn't routinely been done. And we were able to do that with Christian Aid. And the survivors asked for specific changes in humanitarian practice. You can see those in the diagram there on the right. They emphasize the need for psychological support, for immediate livelihood support, for the relationship between communities and NGOs to be looked at. That reconstruction confront root causes in early days, that NGOs work with local government, and that community participation and cohesion be emphasized. And so particularly the psychosocial support element has now been brought into a whole range of different humanitarian practices. So that's just one small example. I think that the reason this was successful is that we were able to, and here's the local action research lesson, we were able to work through a combination of participatory research, but connected to a policy agenda that was already questioning its practices. So the evidence we were able to provide fed not just into local learning, but also a wider policy context, and so it's been taken up quite readily. I want to move on to COVID, and 2 points to make. One here around the ways in which COVID and the drivers of local risk can be described differently if we use community-based knowledge, and a second set of slides really emphasizing the opportunity that COVID brings us. So here's a map, an example of some work led by Faith Taylor and the Kunki Design Initiative out of Kibera, a large slum in Nairobi. And all of those little hands indicates a hand washing station established by local action in Kibera. We were able to, this is a screenshot from a little while ago, but it's a live data inventory. And the point of this is to shift the narrative. It's useful, of course, for local actors to be able to know where the hand washing stations are. But at the early days of the pandemic, there was an assumption, I think, that nothing was happening in informal settlements, that these were places of weakness and probably of future risk. But by mapping things like this, local interventions, there's a hope that you can change the narrative and show that there's a lot of positive action in informal settlements. And actually there's leadership here for the city. And that's been picked up, I think, in some of the ways in which planning, particularly by FCDO, the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, has described places like Kibera as places of innovation. I'll talk about this diagram for a couple of minutes. It's a way of showing, I think, 4 ways in which COVID perhaps changes the way that we might think about risk production. The first is a shift from a single risk domain focus, climate change, flooding, towards a multiple risk domain focus. We really can't think about flooding now without pandemic risk, or at least public health. And we were probably doing that already as community-based activists, but most of the policy world doesn't. But certainly COVID really moves us towards that. And that has implications, therefore, for the ways in which we think about all of the components of risk. Usually, one thinks about adaptive policy and flexible production, resilience as being a key way in which risk is reduced. And those things are still important. But there's a sense of broken supply chains, broken travel, that emphasizes the importance of local production. Now that could be a production of goods, but also production of neighborliness, education, healthcare. So the local has really become emphasized in COVID in the same way that it would do if cities and neighborhoods, their connections to other places were disrupted by, say, a climate-related event, a flood disrupting transport systems. So again, these are lessons that are transferable into climate change. So we have a sense of the thinking about how can communities be made more resilient to multiple risks, and the importance of local sites of production and action. Historically, vulnerability reduction has been a kind of secondary concern, at least for the last 10 years. I think resilience has dominated debates on policy, that sort of footloose ability for businesses or communities to change once a risk is identified, rather than seeking to reduce the underlying causes of vulnerability that place people at risk. This now, I think, needs to change. Not only is vulnerability reduction important, but if as soon as that becomes important, one asks questions about the root causes of vulnerability and risk, and also the ways in which households, individuals, businesses are able to shift their capacities between and across different shocks, dynamic vulnerability, if you will. And all of that has implications for social justice, which were already present, but are now magnified, I think, if we take COVID lessons into climate change, risk and resilience work. And finally, despite claims and advocacy for building back better, the experience of disaster response reconstruction is generally that the quality of people's lives are not enhanced post-disaster. And still, it remains to be seen, but certainly the language around build back better has been enhanced through COVID. So we have this sense across all of the COVID work that there are real, of course, methodological and ethical challenges, particularly around giving low-income colleagues voice. But there's a real opportunity for citizen science to be involved in assessing data on processes of vulnerability production, on local action, to shift the narrative towards the ways in which local processes of vulnerability production connect to more structural processes. And that possibly provides a voice of leadership that can come from local action, which I think we've long demanded, that there's an opportunity in COVID, if we can take that, for us to recast response in COVID to be taking lessons into climate change that are much more sensitive to local processes of vulnerability production, for example. So just to conclude then, we have a lot of capacity in our communities. We have established methods, we have established data collection practices, community-based networks, in my world of the urban poor. And there's an opportunity, the climate urgency and COVID-19 renewal present us to really project our values around collective action, but evidence-based knowledge co-creation into policy. There's a threat, of course, that urgency will mean that business as usual inserts itself into that space. Or indeed that we overlook perhaps some of the leadership opportunities by focusing so much on the local that we don't look up also to the strategic. How might we resolve that? I think it is about continuing what we do, but with even more passion and commitment. And that's a message, of course, to donors as well, to connect local rigorous research with organized advocacy, for example, in the COP, the upcoming COP. Last few words on opportunities for local collaborative action-oriented research. Just to repeat some of the things I've said, basic needs and critical infrastructure, I think, become even more fundamental elements of vulnerability reduction for multiple hazards and for uncertainty proofing, looking towards how we can cope with an uncertain future. And local actors, of course, are key in collecting data and helping provide the vision, delivery and maintenance of that basic infrastructure. Networks of community-based actors within and across cities have a global leadership opportunity in this space. Local places are critical nodes in cross-city flows and cascades of risks, and could be targeted places for action, building on that basic needs point for virtuous cascades, key elements of action that can cascade out security. How might we, though, make cascades visible and learn from local knowledge to project into extra local planning, regulation, and action? So there's, I think, still a challenge, and I'd love to learn from your experiences for local actors now. How, to what extent is a better understanding of flows of resources, of risks outside of local places, but that impact on those local places important for us? What voice should we have in those processes? So I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark, for that excellent overview and going through the pertinent issues. So I'm going to start a conversation with you with a few comments and questions for you to respond to. In the meantime, there is a question in the chat box, and I'll invite others to do that. We can go to those a little later. The first comment I'll make is to share with you something that we feel quite strongly about, which is that there is a significant dichotomy in looking at the urban world and the world of cities around the world, like the big map that you had, uh, and the process of urbanization. Uh, in the former case, we have all these big cities. We know them, they're big cities. Many of them are mega cities. They're extremely complicated places with large populations. Uh, Many of them are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and hence we need to address those issues there. But there is a second order of smaller towns, particularly in the less developed countries, which are still growing. And the future urbanization population is to a very large extent going to be coming to these smaller towns rather than the existing mega cities. Uh, and these smaller towns, in our view, present a significant opportunity because they haven't become big, complicated cities yet. And before they become big, complicated cities, one can intervene and do things there to prevent them becoming big, complicated cities. Once they're big and complicated, you're stuck with the problem. You have to just retrofit problems. But if you can design better planning and better involvement of citizens in planning, investment, then we feel that that is an opportunity for action research, for doing things better rather than preventing or solving a problem that already exists. And the framing of the big cities, in my view, focuses too much on the existing set of problems. Not that I want to minimize them, but I feel that there is another set of opportunities. And I'll give you the example here in Bangladesh, where we are working with around 20 smaller towns, not the big cities, uh, which are still growing and which are likely to become the host cities for the potential future migrants, climate migrants that are going to, inevitably leave the low-lying coastal area of the country and move to cities. Now, if we don't do anything, they'll all end up in Dhaka city. The estimates are around 10 million people over the next 10 years, and Dhaka city just simply will collapse if we have to take on another 10 million. On the other hand, if we can persuade them, we can't force them, but we can persuade them to go to these other smaller towns and settle there, create the conditions for them to settle there, create the interaction between city planners, city mayors, governors, and local populations, including the incoming migrant stroke slum populations, to design a more livable city, town that grows into being a city. We feel those are opportunities. And we've started doing this with a couple of mayors from smaller towns with some very interesting and very positive results. And so we are promoting what we call developing climate resilient, migrant friendly towns. And the climate resilience part is a more structural, physical infrastructure, identifying the flood prone areas, and making physical infrastructure uh, um, more resilient. That is happening now. That I think the civil engineers and the World Banks and the other institutions that invest in physical infrastructure have got the message on climate change, and they're all trying to make their structures more climate resilient. But on the other hand, making them migrant friendly is much more about culture, psychology, people, seeing migrants as fellow citizens rather than as outsiders. And it's about social relationships, and how do we build that? And one of the ways, I'll stop with that and then ask for your feedback. One of the ways that we find is a very interesting way to do this is through education. So we're looking at the potential future migrants, which are people in the low-lying coastal area of Bangladesh, helping them to adapt where they are today, but knowing that there's a limit to how much they can adapt, and they will ultimately have to face the possibilities of being displaced. But taking their younger, children, siblings, youth, girls and boys, and offering them education opportunities in these other towns for going to high school, college, university, and thereby moving to the town, becoming effectively a citizen of the town by living there. And in fact, if you look at migration globally, um, a large part of migration has been for education. A lot of South Asians going to the UK. I went to the UK, to study there, and then I stayed, and many other people do the same. So higher studies is a good route to potentially becoming a citizen of the city, and then they get absorbed, and then they can bring their parents and their family when they want to come, and therefore they can decide when they so-called want to migrate, if they have to migrate. And so this is an area that we find interesting opportunity in the smaller towns that doesn't exist in the big ones. um, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks very much, Celine. That's really interesting to learn, and it almost sounds as though you're promoting education, and I guess one could put health alongside that as a
Absolutely.
reason people might
Correct.
value a particular place, as an alternative to productive investments for urbanization. So rather than setting up a free port or a large manufacturing base, and that being something that attracts labor in a spontaneous way, you're suggesting to invest in social infrastructure that would attract people in a more planned way, which I think is a really exciting idea. It really sort of supports a broader change in the way in which we value social development as part of that process. Um, and I'm certainly reminded of some very nice work um, around Dakar and a particular development called Salt Lake City that I guess people will know well. And this was nice because it was a rare piece of work that was actually able to show that a planned investment around residential and some small business uses had purposefully left out any kind of infrastructure for low income development. And of course, once there was this new urban development, low income families moved in to provide, um, if you want in an economic sense, labor for cleaners and service sector work. And that's entirely predictable and knowable. But so the costs for establishing those low income communities were completely not included in the development. And that's routine, of course. The private developers will develop a place. One expects then this low income population is attracted, and the costs of service provision are for the low income community to provide. In fact, they may even be criminalized. So anything that can take that knowledge that we know, and rather than use it to reduce the cost of economic development for rich elite, in fact, use it to, as you've suggested, promote a safer form of urbanization seems really quite fundamental and important. And of course, you're right that it is those smaller urban centers that are more rapidly urbanizing. Um, yeah, so I think that's the fact that you're working with mayors already is also really good. Most of the smaller urban settlements, of course, won't have mayors or even local
Sure.
government. They'll be associated with other cities. But that sounds like a very positive agenda.
Great. Thank you. So I have another uh, comment for you to reflect on. We just had, in fact, a session a little while ago as part of our thematic set of sessions on urban climate change, and this was with the University of British Columbia and with a think tank in India called PRIA, and with the World Resources Institute and my colleague Shardar Shafiqul Alam from my center, and and they have been doing some work on collaboration between researchers from universities. The university, Professor Murali Lal at University of British Columbia, has a set of activities that he's been doing for some time now with a number of other universities and cities in Canada, where the students and faculty engage with the local communities and try to bring them into the interact with the city authorities and also in any planning decision making. And one of the and the PRIA a group in India, it's a think tank that does very similar work there. It's not a university, but it's a think tank that does a research with local communities, particularly urban communities. Professor Rajesh Tandon. And one of the points that Rajesh brought up was uh, um, a discommunication, if you like, between the way local people perceive issues, know about them, talk about them, present them, and the more formal academics who try and squeeze everything into a academic, jargon heavy report writing academic exercise. There's a big language mismatch. It isn't just, that they may not speak English. It's the way they conceptualize and relate and communicate issues, which even, middle class students in India are not really that good at engaging and understanding and respecting and recognizing the urban slum dwellers, as it were, in that case. And I think that's a real problem. We face it as well. I face it. I'm a middle class Bangladeshi. When I go and talk to relatively poorer sections of the community, it does take a while to get over a feeling of talking down and telling them what to do and listening to them and respecting their knowledge, and then trying to understand it in a manner that then we can then reflect back into a more uh, academic language. But we can't impose academic jargon on them. We have to listen to them. We have to accept their modalities of talking and describing, and then find a way to uh, bring the two together. um, have you had that experience, and if so, any suggestions on how we might be able to do that better?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Um, and it takes me to a couple of projects in Nairobi where we've the starting point of the work there was as an appreciation that urban resilience, is understood in very different ways. So there's several projects in the past have made that comment. But there's an assumption often that those different ways of understanding urban resilience are based on different value positions.
Mm.
And we wondered if those value positions weren't associated with particular languages and perhaps even science and different uses of science and knowledge production. And if that was the case, then rather than having to shift different value positions, which is really difficult, one could simply open the methodologies of science and knowledge production, and that might enable an easier conversation across, as you described, the kind of technical elite and those who have a local experiential knowledge. So we worked actually in a particular project. It was Nairobi was most successful, also Cape Town and Manila, with local communities at risk, where we used arts-based participatory methodologies to solicit what people felt resilience meant, and to identify how resilience was constructed. And very often this was a very holistic sense of resilience around quality of life. Social networks, social cohesion were really prominent in experiencing a quality of life, but also in building resilience. And then juxtaposing that with work with the technical planners, and that was very much a language around global information systems. And resilience there was described as a set of infrastructures. You get a resilient city by good infrastructure, good drainage, transport, and so on. And then we sought to bring these two together. So we held a series of workshops where we were able to map the social networks of importance that the community actors were describing onto a GIS base map that had flood risk and infrastructures. So over a process of months with several workshops, where this worked really well in Nairobi, there was a recognition from the urban planner's perspective that the local population had a lot of knowledge of not just the importance of social networks, but actually where the critical infrastructure was and wasn't working. And out of that has come some planning initiatives that really has broken down a little bit of that barrier, as you describe it. In other places, it worked less well. This is just from our small piece of research in Cape Town. We felt one of the challenges was actually a very high spec, high technology urban planning context that became something of a barrier. So urban planners knew the technology that represented the city very well, but didn't actually get out into the city too often. Whereas in Nairobi, a recognition that the technical infrastructure was less developed actually enabled a more easy conversation with local residents and a more integrated and sophisticated planning outcome. So to me, that was quite a lesson that technology isn't always, the best path to go if one wants to have an improved outcome. In this case, it was something of a barrier.
Sure. I think what the lesson I have is we have to think of out of the box ways of, communicating and listening to people, and then trying to figure out what they're doing. Professor Neil Adja had an interesting project with collaborators here in Bangladesh in Chittagong, where they gave smartphones to people living in the slums and asked them to take photographs of the conditions they were in, and then describe those pictures to the plan. They had workshops with the city authorities and planners, and the people from the slums came with things that they had photographed and described what they had done. And that was a very interesting form of communication in which they were able to communicate in a way that they perhaps hadn't been able to do before. So I think new methods we need to be thinking about of being better at that communication. Um, I'm going to make one further comment and ask you for feedback, and then in the meantime, ask you. There's a question in the Q&A if you'd like to have a look at that, and also a couple of comments in the chat box if you want to just quickly have a look at them. The one I want to raise with you is something that we've been working on for some time now. We call it Voices from the Front Lines, and it started when the COVID situation started. We got some funding from the Global Resilience Partnership to do these interviews with local communities in different places around the world. We did about 30 or 40 of them already, all the way from Solomon Islands in the Pacific to Bangladesh, India, Lagos, and other places. And we publish these as stories. So storytelling, we find, is a very interesting out of the box way as well, letting people tell their own stories. And we publish these as a series of blogs in what we call Voices from the Front Lines. And we've done a sort of meta-analysis of these blogs from these groups and produced a policy brief, which in fact will be presented later on this evening at another session that this group of partners is going to be running, and we also have these different grassroots level groups as part of our Gobeshona program. They're participating in various sessions, and then after the sessions are over, the conference is over, we're going to bring them together and see whether we can think of ways in which the network across countries can be something useful. Can we learn across cities and countries from experiences that different people are having in different places? One of the things with adaptation is it's so context specific that taking lessons from one place in one context doesn't always translate to another place in another context, unless we have better understanding of what these are, and can we create those sharing lessons globally from the local, from the very local, but make them potentially global lesson learning and local knowledge sharing. Have you had any experience of trying to do that?
Not just the local knowledge sharing, but picking up also from the chat. I think it's Celinda Cruz who made the point about um, legacy for local knowledge production, and I suppose that goes to one of the challenges for particularly external overseas researchers who find themselves having often to jump between different funding opportunities and find it difficult to maintain relationships with particular places. As you say, different places have different contexts, and there's a real ethical question there about the extent to which external researchers should be involved with local work. I guess my own career is based on the belief that that is a positive thing, and that external researchers can help to um, share some skills and resource if they're not present locally. But one would hope that funders would increasingly recognize the capacities that exist in local universities worldwide, and indeed research centres, and begin to think about research in ways that can build that capacity over time in ways that enhance links into local places, rather than having the default mode being to fund external researchers that will inevitably have to spend a limited amount of time in local places and perpetuate a hierarchy of university and research expertise between richer and poorer countries. So in the UK, at least, the association between research funding and ODA spending, the Global Challenges Research Fund I'm involved with a little bit, has been quite at the heart of that, has gone some way to raising those questions and increasingly looking towards low and middle income country research leaders as something that is really required, not yet in the rules, if you like, but by peer review for a grant to be successful. And that's quite an exciting move forward, not just because of the implications then for capacity equalizing, but also, to come back to your point, the relationships that one hopes would exist between local research institutions in low and middle income countries and those communities that are at risk and can provide new knowledge innovation of the type we've been discussing. So, I think that's exciting. Whether COVID-19 accelerates those processes or not remains to be seen. I think that's the the battle for the next 3 or 4 years.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mark. We've come to the end of our time, so I'd like to thank you very much for spending your time with us and sharing your thoughts and your ideas of how we might go forward. Just to also flag, for the benefit of the audience and yourself as well, if you're interested, you know that there's this new Adaptation Resilience Alliance to support research being developed with UK FCDO funding. Rosalind West from FCDO and Professor Anand Patwadhan are co-chairing consultations. So they are going to be doing a soft launch of that on the last day of the Gobeshona conference. And one of the things that we are we have been promoting very strongly with them is the need to have a more Southern-led and locally driven research agenda and methodologies that enable that to happen, not just lip service of involving Southern researchers in Northern research led consortia, which is sort of the current paradigm, but actually having Southern researchers lead and have local communities also very much part of the co-production of knowledge that we want to achieve. So that looks like a very exciting prospect of changing the way in which the research gets funded going forward, and hopefully that might make a difference as well for the funding community. So with that, let me thank you again, Mark, for spending your time with us. We will be producing a report on this session and also uploading the recording. So we'll send you a link for that, and do share it with your students and others who might be interested. And if any of your students want to register for sessions coming up over the next few days, please feel free to give them the link to the conference and invite them to participate. We've got lots and lots of sessions still to come, so I'm sure that they'll find the one or two that they might find interesting and want to join. So thank you very much, Mark. I'll say goodbye to you now.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thanks for
Pleasure.
your time.